Welcome, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. It's nice to see you all here on a Friday night. I'm Dan Lewin. I'm the CEO of CHM. I've been here for about 4 years, a little more, half of which has been shrouded by COVID. I appreciate those choosing to wear a mask. I do the same. But anyway, welcome, and thanks for coming tonight. Special thanks to our members and those who have been so supportive of the museum over the last few years. It's been difficult, but we're coming out I'd say quite strong. Our attendance has been really good over the course of the last couple of months that we've been open. So again, we thank you all. And if you haven't, feel free to look at the website and consider joining as a member. We appreciate that so much. One of the things we've been doing over the last couple of years is focusing our attention on our new mission. As an institution, we aim to decode technology, the computing past, the digital present, and the future impact on humanity to shape a better future. I like to say that we've reached a stage in society, kind of like a Starbucks moment. How many people drink coffee? Probably most of you. It's not about the coffee anymore, right? It's about computing. Computers are ambient, they're present everywhere in our lives. Life doesn't exist without them. So with that in mind, our focus and attention in our programming, and this is a special one tonight, is around technology and art and creativity. It's fundamental to the way the world works, and it's fundamental to our culture, and it's growing at a rapid pace in an exciting way. We've got some world-class conversations prepared for tonight with a world-class artist and curator, David Brock. With that, I'd like to introduce Marguerite Gong-Hancock, who will kick off the program. She's the Vice President for Innovation and Programming here at CHM. Thanks, Marguerite.
Thanks, Daniel. I'm so glad to add my warm welcome to each of you for this program on innovative computer art. Recently, the museum opened 2 temporary exhibitions on this theme. I hope you've had a chance, if you haven't yet, that you will take the time to see both of them. In our studio, as we're calling it, you can have a chance to try your hand playing with some AI, with creating art or turning doodles into realistic images or writing some stories. We're really glad that we've been able to collaborate with NVIDIA and Microsoft and OpenAI to bring some of those experiences to you. Also in our screening room, which is just off of our main lobby, now through September 1st, you can see an eye-opening collection of early computer films from 1963 to 1972 that feature really breakthrough artworks by some of the pioneers in computer art. And related to that is tonight's program. But before I get to that, I want to give you a sneak peek that as part of our Tech and Creativity series, on August 11th, we will be featuring Alvy Ray Smith, a computer graphics pioneer and also a co-founder of Pixar, and he'll be talking about his vision of digital light and the evolution of computer graphics and art more broadly. So mark that on your calendar as well as this part of this ongoing series that we're kicking off tonight. So as we kick off, we're really thrilled that we're going to have an opportunity to watch the full version of some of those early computer films, and then have a treat to have a direct experience with some remarkable art by a contemporary artist, and then have a dialogue between those early films and this contemporary art, this intersection of technology and creativity. So as is our CHM tradition, I will introduce our featured speaker, an artist using 5 numbers. So 96, the number of exhibitions on her current CV, 31 monitors in her San Francisco art studio, 9 years as art practice faculty at Stanford, 6,747,666, the number of her patent for, get this, method and system for facilitating wireless, full-body, real-time user interaction with digitally generated text data. So this was based on her TextRain installation. And 625 square feet of backyard garden, which she tends obsessively, including 1 large Santa Rosa plum tree and 1 very large canary date palm. Now you know a lot about her. She is a pioneer in digital and interactive art. She's a recipient of a Macarthur Foundation fellowship. She's professor in the Department of Art and Art History at Stanford, and she holds a courtesy appointment as well in the Department of Computer Science. Please join me in giving a very warm CHM welcome to Camille Utterback. Camille. So glad you're here.
Thank you.
Now to lead this conversation, we are so thrilled that our very own David Z. Brock, our historian of technology and CHM's director of curatorial affairs and director of our software history center is here. He's also curated the current exhibition and the screening film on early films. So David, it's always a pleasure to have you here on stage leading the conversation. So let's give a warm welcome to David.
Marguerite. Okay, well, thank you, Marguerite, and thank you, Daniel, and thank you very much, Camille, and for all of you for joining us this evening. This is such an exciting opportunity for us to publicly present 3 important and remarkable experimental films drawn from our current exhibit, Early Computer Films 1963 to 1972, and to showcase Camille's innovative practice as an artist today. As Marguerite kind of previewed, what I'll do is I'll first provide some background to how these early computer films were created. And then Camille and I will talk a little bit about access to these works. We'll then screen the 3 films, beginning with Stan Vander Beek's Poem Field No. 7, which was created in 1967 and 1968. Then John Whitney Sr.'s Permutations from 1968 as well, and then concluding with Lillian Schwartz's Pixelation from 1970. And after that screening, Camille and I will discuss the films before turning our attention to Camille's work. And Camille will share some of the history of her work with us, and if time permits, I'll ask her some questions about it. So, how were these early computer films made? An important milestone in computer graphics, including computer animation, came in the 1950s when cathode ray tubes, CRTs, screens, were increasingly used with digital computers. For the younger people in our audience who might not have had a direct experience of them, CRTs are like early televisions, creating images by moving a beam of electrons across a phosphor-coated screen. Once computers had screens, people began recording what happened on them using photography and movie cameras. Again, our younger audiences who were born digital might not have an intuition about this as well. Movie cameras, like those used to make the films that we'll watch tonight, worked by exposing successive frames on a strip of cellulose acetate, think a strip of flexible plastic, to some changing scene, and playing a film back in a projector, running the strip past a light shining through it, produces the illusion of motion in the projected image. So, the technology of cinema, movie films, was used to record, store, and present this new world of computer graphics. Computers themselves could be programmed to produce a succession of images on screen to create animations, moving images, and movie cameras could capture this as an output device. At the end of the 1950s, new equipment came to market that automated this process. These systems, these automatic recorders, included both a CRT and a movie camera inside of them and produced film as output. So in the 1960s, you could either use one of these automated recorders, or you could point a movie camera yourself at a display screen. And it's also important, I think, to recall that in this era, computers were generally very large mainframe computers, huge and expensive devices, only possessed by large organizations. Programming was also done in a batch operation, often on punched paper cards. You recorded your instructions on a deck of cards, submitted them to the computer operator, and then sometime later, sometimes much later, you'd get your results. So initially, the uses of this kind of computer animation recorded on film, the uses were for research and for education. They captured mathematical solutions, scientific and engineering simulations, and research visualizations of different kinds. During the 1960s, artists gained access to computers and began to incorporate computer output into their work in both the visual arts and in music. The early visual artists we'll feature tonight were among the most important to bring computer animation into the artistic practice of experimental filmmaking. They created computer animated films by recording screens with movie cameras, and then by manipulating and transforming these sequences by repetition, rotation, colorization, magnification, and combination with other film elements. They exhibit great artistic creativity both in the final films that were created and in their exploration of a new technology and technique in their medium. So that's a sketch of how these films were made. And Camille, I wonder if you could talk with us about some of the access we have had or haven't had to these films since the time they were created.
Sure, and can I add one thing that
Please.
people may not remember too? You
Please.
had to develop the film.
Yes.
It took, so Whitney and some of the recordings I was listening to of him talking about his piece said 12 hours was a fast turnaround. So after you shot frame by frame, you had to send your film, get it developed, and before you could start editing or seeing it. So again, it was such a pain to even think about that it's really easy to forget. But so on the subject of other things that were difficult, David and I were talking about when I was in grad school and as a young artist, I didn't know about a lot of these artists. I'd heard of Stan Vanderbeek. It was really hard. You could only see films projected in a movie theater, that an institution would screen or some art venue would screen. There was no way to just Google online and see some of these things. So it's really amazing now working with students, the access that people have to look at things, although they're often kind of low-res bootleg versions, right? Because a lot of these pieces are owned still by the artists or institutions who maybe don't just want to give them away because they've spent a lot of money to archive them or maintain them, or the artists having made them might want some compensation for things being viewed. That would have happened by a screening fee, which I know for the exhibit here, you were navigating, working with different institutions to make that happen. So it's just, I think, hard to even think back and remember how difficult it was to see these things. And then seeing them, we were talking also about seeing things online or even with nice digital projectors like you have here is still not the same as watching a film, right? The quality of the light and the way these pieces looked originally is very different from even what we'll experience tonight on this nice setup.
Yeah, it's my hope sometime that we can get on loan some prints of these and watch them on a real movie projector. Well, that's great. So thank you.
It's exciting. I meant to say, so this is really exciting to see them on a big screen too.
Yeah, and it's and I can appreciate some of the issues about access for the estates of these artists, or in the case of Lillian Schwartz, the artist herself, who are, incur substantial costs in, preserving the films and storing them in an appropriate environment. It's an ongoing question of kind of maintenance and care for the work. So it is a tension, I think, between making them as widely accessible as possible and the realities of caring for them. Well, maybe with that, we'll turn to watching them. Let me introduce for you a little bit about the first film that we'll screen this evening. Stan Vanderbeek was an established New York City art world figure, an experimental filmmaker and animator. He was also a huge advocate for making new electronic and particularly communication technologies into mediums for new forms of artwork, multimedia artwork. In 1966, through a personal connection, he started working at Bell Labs in New Jersey, collaborating with a researcher there, a computer researcher there named Ken Knowlton, who himself was working on computer animation. In this collaboration, Beek used the Bell Labs mainframe, he used Knowlton's animation programming language, and he used this automatic film recorder to create animations that he used to create a series of films called the Poem Field series. Beek, as Camille was mentioning, only saw the animation results long after he had written the programs for them, leading him to once say, quote, "To make computer films is like learning to draw by pushing a pencil around with your nose." This film, Poem Field No. 7, has a score by the avant-garde composer John Cage, who was part of Beek's scene. So let's watch Poem Field No. 7. All right, well, let me introduce our next selection for you all. John Whitney Sr. was an established avant-garde filmmaker, animator, and composer. Based in Southern California, during the 1950s and into the 1960s, he created what he called abstract films using a very complex electromechanical system derived from surplus military equipment. In 1965, Whitney got a grant from IBM to use digital computers for animation. With this grant, he created a library of animation sequences by filming the then new IBM 2250 graphics display at an IBM lab at UCLA. Whitney then manipulated these sequences, adding color and motion using established movie techniques. To program the animated sequences, Whitney worked closely with an IBM researcher, Jack Citron, who had developed his own programming techniques for computer animation. In computer films like this one, Permutations from 1968, Whitney was interested in what he called visual harmonics, and in computer animation as an instrument for creating visual patterns, much like musical instruments are used for acoustic patterns. So let's have a look at Permutations. All right. Well, let's introduce our final film that we'll screen together this evening. Lillian Schwartz is a multimedia and computer artist who first came to the art world's attention in 1968 through an interactive sculpture of hers at the Museum of Modern Art. The exhibit in which that sculpture appeared led to her invitation to visit Bell Labs in 1969, where she quickly found a place in the research group of the electronic music pioneer Max Matthews. At the labs, she, like Stan Beek before her, collaborated with computer researcher Ken Knowlton. Schwartz, too, created a library of animations that she manipulated, colorized, and, especially in the case of Lillian, augmented with additional film elements. For this film, Pixelation from 1970, Gershon Kingsley, an early figure in electronic music, who was part of Matthews' circle, he provided the score and made it with one of the first synthesizers, the Moog. Schwartz was at Bell Labs for decades, creating a remarkable series of computer films in the first half of the 1970s. So prepare yourselves and let's watch Pixelation. Well, Camille, a lot to talk about there, I think. I guess I'd be interested to hear.
Can we take a moment? I love the idea of the people at Bell Labs sitting and watching a screening of that piece. It's so amazing. Sorry.
Yeah, we actually.
Raw reaction to that.
Yeah. They responded so. I mean, initially there was some surprise, I believe, that Lillian was making these films, and then very quickly AT&T moved to support and fund several of the films of these early films that she made in the first half of the 70s. So. Kind of like a surprisingly supportive reaction, I guess, is what she met with,
good to know.
which is kind of amazing given what we just watched, I think. One thing I really would love to hear you talk about is the idea of layering in the films that we just watched. And maybe just to remind people, the computer animated films or sequences that these artists began with were black and white, no sound. And this is what they were transformed into. So could you talk about, could you react to this idea of layering in the films?
Yeah, so we were talking earlier just about how, looking at Lillian's piece in particular, the kind of fluidity of moving back and forth between these analog processes of dripping ink and filming that, and the microscopy images of the crystals growing and the drawing and the filming, combining that with these really at the time were very high-tech computer-generated images seems sort of strange almost to us now, or it did to me when I first saw these. And then I was thinking about the time period, and it's those microscopy images would have been high tech, right? People weren't familiar with seeing those necessarily. And then also thinking about what David was just explaining, the actual physical work that went into colorizing these films, or physically splice, cut the film, edit it together. They were really manual processes. So thinking about that actually then kind of makes more sense how in the very process to even get the color in these films, there was a very, I think for the colorization, they would project a color, while they were projecting the black and white and re-photograph it. I'm not sure about that, maybe you know more about that, but just that you had to think about, I have a black and white image, and what color am I gonna layer into that, and how am I gonna do that? Creates this sense of richness in the images, I think, that I was saying when I first started working with computers, it felt so much more limited than that. At that point, because the programs that we were using to animate were really vector-based, and the folks who were working in the digital world were often trained more as computer scientists. They weren't necessarily trained as artists, so you weren't thinking about paint at the same time you were thinking about your 3D model or something like that. I feel like I'm roundabout trying to say I feel like the fields kind of diverged almost at some point, and then now maybe are coming more back together with the kind of major motion pictures where the CG is kind of integrated with other forms of media like film, of people, and we're layering or green screening or very complex models where you're putting together, again, a kind of photographic image film with these 3D computer graphics effects. So it was just something that was striking to look at these from now and think about the differences, how they felt at the time compared to now.
Well, another factor that relates to this process of layering and rephotographing and using these systems, I think, called optical printers that were a combination of a movie projector and a movie camera that you could use to rotate things, skew things, but also, literally put a colored filter in there to add color in different places. This, very elaborate process of layering. The kind of aspect that comes through in these films of sort of clarity or careful design that I think relates to all of these constraints that we've been talking about in the way that they were made. Could you just kind of react to to that concept?
Yeah, so I think Whitney's a fabulous example of that. I mean, what can you do with a bunch of dots, right? Like, artists really like constraints, I think, sometimes, because it forces you up against a limit, and then you have to figure out all the possibilities within that limit, and you might find yourself in a really exciting, interesting place because you were faced with that constraint and have to think your way out of it, create your way out of it. You don't have like every tool imaginable available to you. So I think you really see that. And I don't know if it's so clear to everyone in that Whitney film, like if you look at like one of those circles of dots, that's what then was being reprojected over and over. And sometimes it's more obvious, but like I'm not sure how many seconds of film were actually shot, you know, off the computer screen compared to how many seconds were re-photographed in all these other ways. He may have been doing some more, you know, like some of the scaled or shifted versions of those circles may have been computer generated, but I think the techniques, again, were so common to sort of, in this experimental film world, to kind of change things in an analog fashion as you were re-photographing them, that I think that was sort of what Whitney was even known for, maybe, as some of his techniques for doing that.
And I think the you know, to have the films resonate so closely with the music, especially in the case of the Whitney film, where it wasn't like an original composition for the film, the kind of patient planning of the whole thing for something that's so kind of exuberant is just very interesting to me, what it must have taken to plan it out.
Yeah, that would be an amazing exhibit, actually, to look at people's notes, kind of. I mean, Whitney talks a lot about this idea of scores and how he sees these kind of motion graphics as elements of a score, which was also things like John Cage, you know, who did the music for Stan Vanderbeek's piece that we watched, that idea of like scoring, creating a set of rules or a set of instructions for not just music, which we think of that more commonly, although Cage was doing that in such really different ways, like what else can you bring into that musical score other than notes? But that was really part of an idea that people were thinking about at that time. So where was I going with that? I think Whitney was interested that if you watch, there's a really fantastic video you can look up. It's in my notes somewhere here. I'll get to it in my part of the talk, where he really is showing him layering these different pieces together, and he talks about them as like character, like the circle is like part of a character, like an alphabetical character, and then you get to a word when you're thinking about how, you know, maybe it's moving, and then you create a sentence by combining them in a certain way. So back just to this idea of a kind of conceptual clarity is antithetical in a way to what I was talking about, this layering and like very analog, physical manipulating of things that I think of as a more experimental process, this idea of having to plan and score and think in advance, what exactly are you gonna do, right? You didn't have a lot of time to go back. If your computer punch cards that made the animation that went to the, you know, that you saw and got photographed and waited to get developed, your film developed, and you saw it like 2 days later, you know, I don't know how many chances you have to go back and re-edit that.
Right.
I actually noticed there's like one stray dot in Whitney's piece that it really starts repeating when you have a lot of those circles repeated. So I'm very curious about that, if that was really intentional and helped him register things, or that was like a mistake almost, that, you know, it's there now and it just has to stay there.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but I have noticed that dot in my many times watching that film. Well, maybe one last question about these films or issue or something to have you speak to is about the abstraction in these films. And maybe you could help us understand kind of like the landscape of this time in the art world that these films are coming into. And how does that inform how abstract these films are? You know, there's no figuration in them at all.
Well, right, so I'm not an art historian, but the 60s, right, we think of like minimalist traditions, like beginning of conceptual traditions of thinking about like what, how do we describe, what are the boundaries of what a work of art is, and kind of where are those limits? So it's looking at structures. And I think the experimental filmmakers were really looking at that in terms of like, what happens if we scratch on the film, or what are the limits of our sort of physicality, like the flickering, right? Like they were really into kind of like, what like visceral experience can we invoke in you? But that in a way is a kind of abstraction too, right? It's not about showing a figure. It's kind of like, what is your pure experience of this light flashing at you, or like what is what can we think about looking at every permutation of a square or something like that, right? It's, and I think that does have to do with, what was happening culturally, like this sort of putting trust in systems. And then, of course, this is like the late 60s also, and it's very explicit in Vanderbeek's piece, like no war, like peace, no more war, peace. I can't remember the exact thing, right? But peace is no war, right? Like the world is like, in that moment of violence and, racial unrest, again, the civil rights movement is happening. So both exploration of structures, but also a distrust of kind of, like figuration maybe, but definitely exploring those limits of systems, I think.
Thank you very much. Well, perhaps now we could switch gears slightly, or transition into hearing from you, describe your work and some of the, your journey in art creation.
Thank you. So just to say before I start my presentation, it's such an honor to be presenting on a stage after these incredible works. Like I was saying, I didn't know about some of these works, but as I eventually learned about Lillian Schwartz, it was just like so inspiring to me to understand that history. And I love that the Computer History Museum is helping lots of folks understand these deeper trajectories of all the computer tools and artwork we have around us. So super honored. So this is a kind of abbreviated artist talk. So I've picked works to share that I hope can connect to some of the themes we've been talking about, or that I saw in the works we just looked at. One really important difference between all of my work and what we were just watching is that most all of my work anyway is interactive. So I'm using a computer to generate images, but they're always in response to something that's happening in a space. So they're generated live. That is made possible by the speed of computers and the screen technology that was not available in the 60s and 70s. So just to set that up. So the first piece I'd like to show is from 1999. I like to joke this is from the last millennium, for those of you that are into numbers here. And this was actually co-created with myself and Romy Ashatif, who's a fellow grad student with me at the New York University's Interactive Telecommunications program, where we were both grad students. And based on that name, Interactive Telecommunications, you might imagine what we were really grappling with as students was what could we create in terms of interfaces to engage people in these spaces with each other or with the technology. So we were very focused on interaction design largely, not so much animation or film. And so with this piece, Romy and I were thinking about how could we react to more than what was normal at that time for interacting with computers, which was just like a mouse, which is like a single point, right, or a click. Now we're really much more used to having a camera-based interaction with different kinds of imagery, and even our phones, right, like Snapchat filters, Zoom filters, all these things are really, really common, but it was a super novel idea at the time. So this is a piece we made to explore that idea. And also we were thinking a lot about text as a symbolic system and also as a visual system, right? So that's something artists have grappled with for a very long time. Those of you who know sort of traditions of concrete poetry, right? Like what are these strange things of letters? And I think you saw that in some of the works we just saw as well. So I'm gonna play a short video. It's just about a minute long, and the audio doesn't start until about 10 seconds in, so you can get a sense of this piece. And again, 1999, so old video.
Text Rain is a playful interactive installation that blurs the boundary between the familiar and the magical. Participants in the Text Rain installation use the familiar instrument of their bodies to do what seems magical, to lift and play with falling letters that do not really exist. Like rain or snow, the colored text appears to land on participants' heads and arms. The text responds to the participants' motions and can be caught, lifted, and then let fall again. The falling text will land on anything darker than a certain threshold and fall whenever that obstacle is removed. If a participant accumulates enough letters along their outstretched arms or along the silhouette of any dark object, they can sometimes catch a word or even a phrase. The falling letters are not random, but form lines of a poem about bodies and language.
So yeah, I can talk tons about the interaction design and lots more to say about this piece, but in terms, I wanted to show it because it was this very early piece for me, but I liked the connection to Vanderbeek's text in poem field, right? There's this obvious connection to that, how we're both animating text. But I think there's something in both these pieces too about how that textual information kind of becomes illegible or legible at different points. Like, right, what is the boundary between when we can read a word or can't read a word in these systems of representing language on a screen. And I think there's also something deeper in there where if you're making work with code, at least what I was doing in this, which was programmed in C++, is you're like using a language also to encode the behaviors that this work is enacting, right? So I had to write the rules in language, and then that language is like turning into this visual image too of, or at least the behavior of the text landing on people's hands. So you start asking these questions of yourself, right? Like what is happening in this process of encoding rules into visual symbols that are language that then are being re-expressed by the computer on a screen, or when we're talking to each other, like what gets lost in that translation. And I thought Vanderbeek's using those characters made out of dots and then kind of moving them around so that you can't read them anymore is kind of asking us about that boundary. And those of you who know Jim Campbell's work, who's an artist, well, an internationally known artist, but here in the Bay Area, think often his work, which is very pixel-based, like puts you in that space too of wondering, like, when can I recognize an image, or when does it turn into just a field of dots? Mm-hmm. And that's part of when you're thinking about images stored in a computer, this grid is underlying everything. So this is a little professor moment here, but I think in this image, hopefully you can see there, you can actually see the pixels in the hands, right? So there's little squares that you can see. This was actually only 320 by 240 video that we were digitizing into the computer at that time. So that was really slow for the technology at the time from converting it into digital information. But I wanted to just talk about that bitmap image as being a kind of fundamental way that you can encode information on a computer. It's one way. We were talking about like some of those experiments that the artists were doing at Bell Labs, like Knowlton's system of sort of using ASCII text which is some of the other work that Vanderbeek and he were working on, to make a dark character, like a period or something, where most of the image around it is dark, read as something dark, and a bold A, a capital A, read as light. So they were making images out of characters too, and then starting to think about like, oh, this grid of information could be an image. And so I don't know the whole history of like how much that work was really fundamental to this technology that is now on all of our phones, right? Any digitized photograph is a grid of information. But that encoding is really fundamental to all of these developments. The other way you can encode information is a vector, so a list of x, y points that maybe could be generated by a formula like for a circle or something. Or just stored as a list after the fact. But that encoding is what lets me then start to create interaction, or anyone who's working sort of procedurally with changing images based on a set of rules. So for example, and that's the last thing I'll say on this slide, my rules in the system is I have a list of where the text is, each character is, and a speed it's trying to fall at. So every frame of video that's coming in, the live video, 24 frames a second, the code looks like, what is the pixel I'm trying to move to? Like if I'm the letter M, where am I trying to drop down to? Is it light enough? In that case, I'll print there. If it's too dark, I can't print there, and I look for a light pixel above that. Right? So it's a pretty simple rule, but it really effectively creates this illusion of interaction. And it's actually the simplicity of the system, which is part of what got at the patent. There were other systems out at the time which were much more complex, trying to build a map of like who the people are, or where are they in the space, which is much more like what is common now, these sort of higher level analysis of the image. But the computers I had access to were definitely not fast enough to do that at the time. So this was a kind of simple way to accomplish that. So again, I think that's sort of a little, what underlies a lot of this work is that sense of encoding. I wanted to also talk about a set of work that I hope gives you a sense of how artists work using those rules. And also connect a little bit to what I find super exciting in some of the works we just saw. So we talked a little bit about this layering already. These are works where I started being able to create much sort of richer abstract images. In the text frame piece, everything was live, right? Like every frame the letters were moving, but there was no history. In these works, which is a series called External Measures I worked on from about 2001 to 2004, I started thinking about the surface, like that bitmap, as a place I could store information and keep it from frame to frame. So much more like a painting surface rather than like every frame being unique. And that, it seems so obvious to me in retrospect, but it took me, I did a lot of pieces that where the video was just always live before getting to this point. And again, I think part of that was, like we were talking about, in the computer, that was easy to generate the frames. So I didn't have the constraints of like trying to colorize it separately or something like that. So this idea of layering came to me later. This is at a show at the Milwaukee Art Museum, I should say, in 2008. And you can see I don't know if you can see, I flipped the camera to the ceiling, so I'm looking at people from more a bird's eye view. And whenever they're in that light square on the floor, that's when the piece is tracking them. So another thing that I thought really connect to Lillian's work and why I was so inspired by her, one of the many reasons I was so inspired by her work is this combination of kind of more messy, like fluid things, like things from the messy world, the analog world. And it was hard for me to figure out how to do that with the coding skills I had at the time. But I eventually got this idea I could scan in hand-drawn marks and move those around algorithmically. So those are part of the rule-based system, and that was like a huge revelation for me as well. And then, let's see, where am I? So I will show 2 minutes of video about this and then talk about this other idea that we were talking about with Whitney of sort of how do you compose, how do you think about a set of movements like as a composition. So I'll talk about that next, but I think next is my video. Oops, no, this was the beginning. So this is where I was at before I figured out how to scan in the marks. So this was a piece early in this series that was just very, very vector-based. So I wanted to show you that as kind of like why, to me, these pieces were a real leap for me in terms of changing the kind of imagery. So here's the video.
Untitled Five is the 5th interactive installation in the External Measures series, which Utterback has been developing since 2001. The goal of these works is to create an aesthetic system which responds fluidly and intriguingly to physical movement in the exhibit space. In these dynamic works, the positions, velocity, and existence of various parts of a projected image depend on people's presence and movement. Some responses are direct and immediate. Other behaviors evolve over time based on the flow of people in the space. In Untitled Five, a network of gray lines flickers around one's body and immediately indicates your presence. A colored line is drawn along your trajectory. When you leave the installation, this line is filled with tiny marks. These marks can now be pushed from their location by other people's movement. Displaced marks attempt to return to their original location, creating smears and streaks of color as they move. These painterly swaths are the result of intersections between current and previous motion in the space, conceptually linking disparate moments in time. Untitled Five reacts to stillness as well as motion. Standing in place sets off a delicate spray of dots which radiate from the center of one's body. While one's presence generates marks, it also erases older marks. The rules of Untitled Five are carefully constructed to create an overall composition that is organic, open, and evocative, while still being completely algorithmic. While the specific rules of the system are never explicitly revealed to participants, the internal structure and composition of the piece can be discovered through a process of kinesthetic exploration. Engaging with this work creates a visceral sense of unfolding or revelation, but also a feeling of immediacy and loss. The experience of this work is the experience of embodied existence itself, a continual flow of unique and fleeting moments.
Right, so I'm gonna move ahead here. And I wanna talk, the video was trying to explain this idea of like the different layers of the composition, meaning the different sets of rules that I put together to create the imagery that I was trying to create, and also the interactions I wanted. So I want people to kind of be able to find themselves clearly, but also have things that are a little more mysterious that are happening. So I want to show you a little bit of a behind the scenes, because I think for some people that's like, but okay, Camille, but what do you really mean by that, right? So I'm going to walk you through like how this piece started and then how it got to this, which is a still of, you know, coming out of that would have been generated in the actual interactive space. So this is the beginning. I was just and these are screenshots from a setup in my studio where I had the camera on the ceiling and I would code something, get up, run around, and take a screenshot of what happened. So this idea was like, okay, how about when someone moves, I have all these lines, which are a list of points, and when someone walks across, the points have to move. So you can kind of see that in the middle. I hope you can see the middle of that, those vertical sort of scraggly lines. Someone has walked across me and pushed the points around a little bit. So this is a more extreme version of that, just playing around. This is this moment of starting to scan things in, so that a hybrid idea of like I have the points that I can move around procedurally, but I'm going to try to scan things in and hook those textures to those marks. It's a little more clear, some Sharpie lines. I actually replaced all the line segments with Sharpie marks here. And then this kind of aha I was talking about of like, oh, they don't just have to move every frame. I can kind of have a background where hopefully you can see here these lines kind of not erasing every frame, not clearing the frame buffer for those of you that are animators. Just more experiments with that. This was a moment, I got sort of bored with that. I was like, what if I could see more clearly where people were moving, because it wasn't always obvious how you were pushing things away. So I started actually storing points of someone's trajectory and thinking about how to draw that line, combining those things together. This was a real important moment for me where I realized, okay, I'm storing information, I'm storing these lines when someone walks across, like I've made that horizontal line because I walked across, but that's all just still encoded, and I could create a connection between those dots and something that's happening later in time. So the vertical stripe going up the screen is me walking vertically in this, or I'm walking towards the screen, and that line has displaced the more horizontal line. So the sort of arc of points is a second moment in time interacting with the first moment in time, if that makes sense. So it's like, oh, now this encoding isn't, I can start making much more dynamic rules and behaviors that were very exciting to me as an artist. So again, playing around with different kind of scans or that dot pattern, seeing what kind of scan marks work well in different ways when I push them around. So I started replacing the whole lines with these scanned in marks, playing with colors, and sort of eventually hooking all these things together in different ways into the final piece. So that is that. Artists often circle back to ideas many, many years later. So this is a piece from 2018 and named Precarious. So I don't know how many years later after that, 2004 to 2018, but I wanted to show this as what would be possible in these kind of drawing systems with much higher resolution, sort of different abilities of kind of physics systems in a piece. So I will show you a little bit about this piece as well. And I think in this piece, you can also see, as soon as you can encode behaviors that are changing with time, you have things like growth processes and decay processes, which I think you really saw in Lillian's work too, like these things moving and growing, or maybe even in the Van der Beek piece of like the sort of almost game of life, like dots changing in those mandalas like over time. This was actually a commission for the National Portrait Gallery for a show called Blackout, Silhouettes Then and Now. And the curator, Asma Naim, called me and asked me, would you like to create a piece as a contemporary artist for the show? And I was like, I don't get it. Like, what? Yes, of course. But, some of the other artists in the show were like Kara Walker, who, if you know her work, is like very clearly connected, to this history of silhouettes and some of the different historical implications of that. So I didn't really understand, but Asma said, well, Camille, in your computer vision systems, you're extracting people's silhouettes, like in order to react to them. So it's a very sort of contemporary way to do this. And these silhouettes, historically, these are from a time in the 1800s, just before photography, or maybe 20 years before photography is invented. And she's like, they were technology. Like, this was high technology of its time. So I was like, okay, that's really exciting. And I wanted to show you, so this is the Fizziano Trace, which is how, the one on the left is how you would create these silhouettes. So you stuck your cheek up to the sort of paddle-like thing at the bottom, and someone would trace your head, and it would make a small version, like a 2-inch small version of that. It's hard to see, but up at the top is a little piece of paper. And so the animation on the right is showing you, like, if your head was the green heart, the tracing is the red heart, done with something called a pantograph. And I was really curious to know, as I was reading about the history of the pantograph, that this is also how a lot of milling translations were made, so from a pattern onto a lathe or a mill. And then looking at the Catmull and Park animation in the full screening, these researchers, amazing researchers and computer graphics pioneers, are like figuring out, like making dot patterns on 3D shapes and sort of translating those into a computer to create the very beginnings of our sort of 3D graphics. So I think Asma's name was very insightful to see this connection, which I didn't see. So I just want to share that with you. It's part of why I love what you all are doing here. Again, just to harp on that point of like thinking none of our technology, Silicon Valley likes us to think that everything is like disruptive and brand new, but it is not. And I think we forget those things to our peril. So just also a side note, the history of these profiles, which was a cheap and democratic way to get a picture of yourself, is also, the analyzing of these profiles to decide who was a criminal and who wasn't, who was a good person, who wasn't, was also a part of that history that the show goes into. And that is clearly, with all the AI, racial profiling, and the problems with our database, it's still with us, right? So again, forgetting those histories is a really bad idea. So I will just show you a video of this piece that's about 3 minutes long.
Precarious is an interactive installation developed for the National Portrait Gallery exhibition Blackout, Silhouettes Then and Now. The piece extends the historical practice of tracing human silhouettes with a mechanical apparatus on a backlit screen. Instead, Precarious traces gallery visitors with contemporary digital tools into an ever-evolving projection. To create this work, Utterback uses a ceiling-mounted depth camera to record people's silhouettes as seen from above. Her custom software continually interprets and redraws this data into the projection. In the Precarious system, silhouettes are never fixed. When Utterback's software detects a person, a black line begins tracing their shape. Since people are always moving, even when trying to stand still, the tracing never generates a completely closed shape. Precarious renders people not with the stark fixedness of paper silhouette cutouts, but as tremulous outlines of bodies moving through time. Each person's silhouette is also visually altered by the movements of other people in the exhibition space. Past outlines are erased as new participants enter the space and overwrite the previous imagery. As Utterback's software draws people's outlines, each line is translated into a series of points. The points slowly evolve into larger points, and eventually into colored elements which resemble ripped pieces of paper. Participants discover they can push and manipulate others' existing outline marks with their own body. Pieces from one person's silhouette can move and accumulate along another person's outline, becoming shared evidence of both people's presence. Precarious creates a space where intermingled personal boundaries are publicly negotiated and visualized as sites of constant change. The only time silhouettes are clearly drawn in Precarious is when a participant leaves the installation. Then, a bird's eye outline of their form is drawn as a flattened shape which resembles the more traditional silhouette form. When no one is present in the installation, shapes from the past accumulate like ghosts. As the artwork's title suggests, Utterback reimagines the silhouette as a more transient and interdependent portrait. In the Precarious artwork, a fixed self, or a self cut off from those around us, or isolated from the past, is impossible.
So I think we're basically out of time, or we want to move on to some other questions, but please check out my website. I've done a lot of other kinds of works, I think not necessarily related to this program here, but site-specific, sort of architecturally integrated pieces. So thank you.
Thank you, Camille. Thank you for sharing that with us. I'd love to ask you a bunch of questions, but we don't have time, so I'll just ask you one that's a very important question for the museum that we ask of all the people, many of the people we interview and all of the people we feature here on our stage, which is a one word of advice. One word of advice for somebody starting out on their life and career, what would it be? And I know you have thought of it and written it down, and I thought you could share your one word with us and tell us why you chose it.
So I think the piece I was just showing has a little bit to do with this too. I think, again, there's this sort of mythology in our culture right now, especially in Silicon Valley, of a kind of lone hero, often a male hero. And that is just not the way things really happen. I think to do anything exciting in the world, you need to have a community. You need to have people that, lift you up and you're feeling like you can't do it, or your work isn't good. You need people that give you unvarnished, really harsh criticism too, and you need that feedback. So I think look for community, find who those people are that can support you and can be honest with you, and then give back to them too. Because looking at these folks who are heroes, real heroes from the past, we need to keep those connections going between our work. And if the pandemic has taught us anything too, it's that we're all connected.
Well, thank you so much for such a wonderful answer. And I think now I'd like to invite Daniel back to the stage to close out the evening.
Well, please join me in thanking Camille and David. I love your one word and your work. One of the things that I think is important to a program like this and all of our programs is that you've learned something. And so if you haven't noticed, please do notice that there's a little QR code near your seat, which will take you to a survey. We'd really like your feedback to have a better understanding if this whole notion of decoding technology, the computing past and the digital present has shaped a new perspective or given you some new insight into the world within which we live. I think the thing that's been most exciting for me, having been in this industry for over 40 years, is that, as Camille said, there is the invention, there's a moment in time of the new tool, but the innovation is about the changes in structure and how things move, and we think about radical business models and things like that often as fundamental to kind of the notion of our culture. But in fact, when you get to the basics of culture, the sounds and the images that are universal, as opposed to kind of the rational tasks that computing often brings to the fore, are pretty fundamental. And we've reached a stage now where I think in society, the kinds of thinking and reflection that this type of work brings to your mind's eye is important as we recognize that we are kind of one world. I oftentimes think about our mission at the museum as one not unlike the environmental issues that we face as a whole Earth. And if everyone on the planet, every moment was conscious of their actions relative to the environment, we wouldn't have environmental problems. If everyone on the planet was conscious of how they acted in a world that doesn't exist without computing, we maybe would have a slightly better world as well. And things like this motivate at least me and hopefully you and others that you might share it with to think more deeply about the world we live in and what we can all do to make things better. So thank you for this inspiration. It's really been wonderful for me personally. And again, let's offer another welcome and thank you.
Thank you.